Hi, GG gang. Welcome back to another episode of Gossip Girlies. I'm Cassie,
And I'm Kristen.
and we are super excited for this episode today because we're having our first guest. I'm so excited. We have Miss Aly Bird with us, and she's going to be talking to us about her book, Grief Ally. I'm so excited, Aly. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. I am so happy to be here and chat with you and hang out.
And
Yes.
even though, as you can probably tell, that we're going to get into maybe some heavier topics, but I'm sure we'll still make it fun and light but also learn and share along the way.
Absolutely.
You can have it both ways.
So first, obviously me and Kristen did read the book, and we're gonna definitely be giving our 10 out of 10 review on our highlight reels this week. So we just kind of want to give the listeners kind of an idea of who you are and kind of how you got started on writing the book and things like that.
Yeah. Um, so I am a coach. I have a background in community development. I am a therapist in training. And in 2019, I was moving through life, thought I was doing a pretty good job at it. And all of a sudden, my husband died completely unexpectedly, hiking accident. And I was thrown into the world of grief without any understanding of what was happening to my body, what was happening in my brain, and the world around me. Like everything was changed. And very early on in the process, a grief expert, someone who, was a role model, suggested that I go find community. So I tried. I joined 13 different Facebook groups. And before sharing my own story, I was listening to my widowed peers. And what I discovered was that they were feeling very abandoned and misunderstood and forgotten. And I couldn't relate because the people around me were doing such a good job of staying engaged, continuously showing up, even if they were making mistakes or being afraid and anxious. And so I, being a person who was very much in my brain, I'm a cognitive instrumental griever, which I'm sure we'll get into the definitions of those. But for me, my grief experience was very like about problem solving and understanding the science of what was happening to my brain and body and my environment. So I kind of took this really positive support experience that I was having, along with all this research that I was doing, as well as my background in coaching and community development, and put it all into this tool, which became Grief Ally, the book, helping people you love cope with death, loss, and grief. And that's kind of where I am today, trying to help people help others who are bereaved by giving them kind of a roadmap for how to show up when something really bad happens to someone they love.
Right. And I think that is what makes your book so different. I've never seen anything like it. It's not just you've had a terrible thing happen to you. Here's how to get through it personally. It's more of focusing on how to help someone in your life get through it, which I think I've already been in a situation like that where I've had close friends lose somebody, and you have the feeling of just like, I don't know what to do to help them. I want to help them, but I don't know how. So when you experienced your loss, can you tell us a little bit about the people in your life who rallied around you and were grief allies? What did they look like? What did they do for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, I'm gonna cough.
I was about to do the same thing.
Yeah, great.
Cough break,
A round of
everybody.
coughing for everyone. Wonderful. um, yeah, so my support people were amazing. I call them my front row. So in the book, I talk about this concept of being a front row student to someone who is in grief, because grief is so unique for every person that there aren't really like specifics about what I can say to really be there. But what I say is to be a front row student. respect the person that you're trying to help as the expert. So I have a few best friends who, I called instantly. And the things that they really did were let me be the leader and respected everything that I asked for and that I needed, and did that with unconditional love and just complete respect for how I was going to move through this situation. Um, but I can give you like some really like specific examples. So I have a friend who, after someone dies, you get the message about like, oh, bring food. Like food is like the thing you do, right?
Mhm.
This friend is not, she does not spend time in the kitchen. Like takeout is like her go-to. And then in terms of food, she like brought a box of like Ritz crackers because that's like her like comfort food. But she's like the most amazing like note taker, and her attention to detail is fantastic. So when I was having really important like conversations or like looking at paperwork, like she was the person who was there next to me and really paying attention when I didn't have full use of my brain.
Mhm.
Um, Other people, showed up and like cleaned my bathtub, because I was like, I would like to be in my bath, but it's a mess right now. And they were like, no problem, I got this. And there were other people who like brought food and stuff too. But I think the important thing about grief support, and I teach this in the book, is that use your own strengths and assets. Like you do not have to be the food person, if you are not good at food, right? If that is not your thing, you have other assets. You have a guest room, you have access to a hot tub, you're great with like walking the dog, whatever. Like there are other tasks that you can do that really play to your strengths. And like that's where you can be useful.
Right. Because of course, eating is very important, but think
Of
of like
course.
just every single thing that we do every day that someone who's going through grief like probably needs help with. There are
Yeah,
hundreds of things, basically.
exactly. And I also like I advocate, like I have this message of, food will often get you in the door, but then what you do when you get inside, like what are you going to do then?
Mhm.
And what you do when you're inside matters as well.
Mhm.
Right.
Which is really why I wrote the book, because if you really love someone, like you care deeply about them, you're one of the people who are like, yes, I'm going to bring food. Like food is often not enough, which is why there are also many other lessons, in the book as well, because it does matter how you show up, and social support is everything, when things happen. Yeah, life inevitably ends.
It's so funny though, because I'd honestly never really sat and thought about like, okay, when people have passed away in my life, people brought us a lot of food. And then I started sitting there thinking about it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I remember after my grandma passed being like, I can't eat another piece of chicken if someone put it in front of me. So I feel like you kind of like explaining that and like being like, yeah, that wasn't enough. Like that wasn't what our family needed in that moment. And like I felt like it was such a good example to like hopefully help people think like, okay, yeah, it still might be nice if I bring them something to eat so they don't have to worry about it, but maybe I should like actually stay and sit down and be like, what do you need to talk about right now, like instead of just here's food so you don't have to think about that one thing.
Yeah, like I'm not discounting the food, like by all means, like a
Right,
lasagna,
always.
like I
Yeah.
love that. Like, oh man, carbs, like give it to me, right?
Yes.
But also like there's so much more that needs to go into the process of and conceptualization of how we show up for people who are bereaved, rather than exclusively like what their next meal is going to be.
Yes. Hmm.
So through this whole process, I'm sure, like aside from your own grief, I'm sure that there are also people in your life who have lost a loved one. So what are some of your favorite ways personally to show up as a grief ally? What do you really think that you're good at in being an ally?
Mm, I think my greatest strength is like I am willing to like sit with discomfort and ambiguity and like pain and suffering, really, And like, I will be the person who will sit next to you. Like, we don't have to talk. But like, I will say, like, everything you are feeling is valid and it is okay. Um, yeah. And I think that that's a learned skill. Obviously, like, I talk about in the book like some mistakes that I have made. Like, we don't learn the skills to like be a grief ally. This is
Mhm.
something like, this is knowledge that we have to seek out, really, like in Western culture, in my
Mhm.
opinion. And I have learned like through life experience, um, what I am good at, as well as like what I want to do in a grief support role. Um, and yeah, it is definitely like sitting with discomfort. And that doesn't always mean like in the context of death either. Like when times are shitty, right? Like during COVID, like people losing their jobs, or, you know, life plans getting postponed, like all those things are ideas and notions that we have about ourselves that we're attached to. And then when that doesn't happen, like that is grief, and you can practice grief allyship in those moments. And I think, yeah, that's where my strength is probably like pointing it out and being like, hey, like that's, you're experiencing grief right now, like do you want to just
Mhm.
like take a minute and acknowledge how shitty this is? Like, we can do that.
Yeah. Even though, like you said, it's uncomfortable, it's weird. Grief is not a very good feeling. So, I mean, that's kind of how I personally deal with things. Like, whenever I have a sad thought, I'm like, oh, if I just don't think about the sad thing, then I won't get sad, which is like a total terrible way of coping with anything. I'm working on it. I'm working on it. But
Aren't
I
we
find
all?
Right. I find that too, a lot of the skills that you talk about in the book, it's not even just specific to grief. Like, you could do this if you have a friend who has a baby,
Mhm.
even though, like,
Absolutely.
I don't have a child, I can't really relate to you, but I will show up for you. Or you have a friend who recently went through a terrible breakup. Like, how can I just show up for you in this thing? And like you're saying, it can show up as grief too, you know, with the loss of a relationship. You can grieve that
Mhm.
relationship.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I'm so happy you brought that up, Kristen, because like I think the, yes, the book is written like more specifically for grief. And I think a lot of people, when something bad happens, they are looking for the answers to like, what do I do and how do I help? But really, the lessons in there are like just great life lessons about how to be in relationship with
Mhm.
other people,
Mhm.
right? Whether that's a friendship, whether that's like a sibling, whether that's a relationship with like an intimate partner, like these are just really good lessons for how to be a like kind and caring human being.
Mhm. It's just a different type of loss.
Yeah, exactly. Which, you know, we can talk about like the, I think people have it in their minds that grief only happens when people die.
Mhm.
And like that simply isn't true, right? Like grief is like a, it is in our DNA to attach to people and to places and to things and ideas, whether that's they're good for us or bad for us or just happen because, you know, it's our biological family. And when those attachments like shift or change in any way, there's like an energetic tension that's created. And that
Mhm.
in itself is grief. So if there's
Mhm.
like a goal that you had for yourself and you didn't reach it, like, oh, yep, there's grief. Like
Mhm.
someone becoming a mother and like this change in identity, like that's grief too.
Mhm.
So it's not always death or
Mhm.
physical, like human death.
Mhm.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
so interesting bringing up the mom thing. I don't remember exactly where I saw it, but this woman gave birth and she was just like, I feel like sad. Like, I love my baby, but I feel so sad. And her mom was like, well, you're grieving. Like, you're grieving the person that you were before and how you can never be that person again. So I really love how in the book, I feel like you touched on that. It was not just loss. And another thing that I loved was just you were really breaking down those societal standards and like the stigmatism that comes with grieving however you need to grieve. And I mean, there were points where I was like literally getting emotional reading it myself. I
Mm,
was like, this girl is just telling me like all these other people, forget about them, like do what you got to do. And I hope that was the message that you were trying to explain and I took it correctly. But I'm even getting like a little bit emotional talking to you right now about it. I'm like, I got tears in my eyes. But I think it was so helpful, even like being someone who has lost people before. So
Yeah.
I really appreciated your book, if I didn't already say
Mm.
that, and just really enjoyed your insight on everything and breaking down those stigmas too.
Thank you, Cassie. That means a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, in our culture, there's a lot of misconceptions about grief. And one of them is like the time that it takes to like get better about it, like
Hmm.
feeling about it. But the reality is that it never ends, right?
Hmm.
And I think there's a great organization called Being Here Human, and they like equate the concept of grief to childbirth. And a woman's body knows what to do when a baby is being born. It kind of happens involuntarily, whether you are ready or not, right? They're like, this baby is coming out.
Hmm.
Grief is the same way. Our bodies innately know how to grieve changes in attachment, but we have done a real disservice in our culture of erasing the things that are hard and that
Hmm.
are uncomfortable. And we can numb with all sorts of, drugs, alcohol, work, exercise,
Hmm.
food, so that we don't feel any of that like pain and discomfort. But then when grief happens, particularly if it's like a death related loss, and that person is kind of gone from our physical lives forever, we're like, what do we do with this pain? Because it is unlike anything else and it can't be fixed. The only thing that would fix it is if that person came back from the dead, and that's not possible, right? So it's
Hmm.
always this tension that kind of lives within us that our bodies know what to do with, but our culture is telling us, like, don't feel bad, don't feel sad, don't feel angry, particularly if you're a woman.
Hmm.
Um, and like get over it as quickly as possible so that we can get on with the life that you had before. And the reality is that like death changes everything, and that is okay. Like it is okay for losses in our life to reorganize the way we operate in the
Hmm.
world. Um, but we get so stuck in a culture that doesn't want us to change, that wants us to keep moving forward with blinders on at the
Hmm.
expense of ourselves. And I really don't think that's fair. And I'm so happy you took that lesson from the book that, you are allowed to do what feels right to you to cope
Hmm.
with the pain of loss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Especially if you're working somewhere and it's like, I only have 3 weeks of bereavement leave before I apparently need to get
Oh,
my shit together and somehow like work again. Like
Oh,
impossible, but
yeah.
okay.
Yes. There are so many barriers. Um, yeah, from bereavement leave to, being in relationships that don't acknowledge our loss. And we can talk about disenfranchised grief and like, yeah, there is a certain privilege that comes with being able to experience and give yourself the space that your grief really needs um, to live alongside it.
Yeah. You talk about this in the book too. It sometimes it kind of feels like too that people just kind of want to like drag you out of your grief hole by saying, at least you got the time with him or her that you did, or at least they're not suffering anymore. And it's like, at least, but that person is not here anymore, you
mhm.
know? Like I could have
Yeah,
gotten more time with that person. Um, which I, if someone says that you hope that it's coming from a good place, but it's like I'm not really trying to look for like silver linings right now. I'm sorry. Although
yeah,
it may help you
exactly.
feel better, but like it's not really what I want to hear in this moment.
And I think that's a big like these cliches exist because we haven't when you are down and like in your pain and suffering, like the last thing you want to do is be like, excuse me, let me just police your language for a moment here, right? But like looking back on it, it's like, yeah, like a lot of these phrases, the service that they are offering is for the person saying them,
Mhm,
less about the person who they are trying to comfort.
mhm,
Like the at least thing is like In the book, I talk about the ghost sentence, which is a Megan Devine tool with like every time you use an at least phrase, there's a missing half of the sentence, the ghost sentence, which essentially says, so stop feeling so bad. So in the book, I use the phrase like, at least you got 5 good years with him in brackets. So stop feeling so bad.
Mhm.
And right, like no one actually told me to stop feeling so bad. But the concept of like, hey, you should be grateful for this and stop feeling so bad. And like that sucks.
Mhm.
Like I am allowed to appreciate that I got the time with Will that I did, but I am also allowed to be like deeply saddened by the fact that I don't get a future with him either.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Something else that I really liked that you brought up was like how if you don't handle the grieving process properly, how it can affect you physically, whether it's like
Mm,
your brain kind of altering different pathways or even turning into like actual physical health issues.
yeah. Um, and I think like this isn't exclusive to grief. This is just like a really great basic self-care lesson that
Mhm.
like if you do not acknowledge your feelings and emotions, and I recognize that there is a level of privilege that comes with that, you need to be able to have like the space and resources to acknowledge what it is that you're feeling and have that level of self-awareness. But if you don't, like it lives inside of you. It needs to get out some way. It wants to get your attention. So if you don't give it the attention that it asks for, like off the bat, it's going to manifest as anxiety, depression, stomach issues,
Mhm.
like illness. And you're not going to be in a position to help anyone. And you're going to be in a poor position to help yourself too, if you let that go too far.
Mhm. I think so many people
Mhm.
don't think about like how it could end up affecting you in other ways if you don't take the time or the opportunity to at least try to really feel and handle. But I definitely understand what you're saying about being a privilege. Like there are definitely situations where people just might not know, which you're trying to help, which I love and appreciate. The resources or might not have people around them that are equipped to handle them through that. So um, I hadn't really thought about it that way. So I appreciate you bringing that up. That is definitely something unfortunate.
Yeah, you talked about like only getting a short amount of time, like if you have bereavement leave, right? And if you are and bereavement leave often is like you have to be a direct like descendant
Mhm.
or it has to be like your child or like your
Mhm.
spouse for you to be able to like take time off work. Um, but if like what if it's your best friend who died?
Mhm.
Like what if it's one of you two
Ugh.
that died? Like the you wouldn't like I don't know what your day jobs are unfortunately, but like realistically, like you wouldn't like get that bereavement leave and
Mhm.
yet you would feel significant loss
Mhm.
um from that death. So yeah, there is certainly a privilege with it. But to be fair, there are also it doesn't necessarily have to you don't have to have bereavement leave to cope with some of those feelings. There are like smaller, more tangible things that you can do. And I teach this in the book about self-care. It's just like being self-aware, just recognizing like, and it doesn't, you don't have even have to name it sometimes, just like, hey, I'm like feeling a little bit uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And I'm just gonna recognize that and own it. And I can sit with that. But if you can name it and it's like, oh, like this discomfort is like anger, like I'm feeling like the injustice of this loss or this change in attachment for whatever reason. Um, and then do something with it. Like if you're angry, like, you know, with within the realm of like, don't bring harm to yourself and don't
Mhm.
harm others, but like maybe screaming into a pillow is like gonna help instead of like, clenching your jaw and just like fighting your way through it. That can be a really useful tactic.
I am a
I've screamed into
huge
plenty of pillows.
yes, I was about to say I am a huge proponent of the screaming method. My
Yeah.
stepsister and I, every time we go to the beach, we scream into the water. When we're at our parents' house, scream into the forest. It
Beautiful.
honestly, the first time she made me do it with her, I was like, "This is so weird. Like, what are you doing?" She's like, "Just trust me, just do it." And I was like, "Oh my God, I feel like I just got so much out."
Yeah. Yeah, it's really powerful.
I thought it was so important too. Like the way that I kind of looked at your steps through being a grief ally. I don't know if this is like your intention, but I kind of looked at it as kind of like a hierarchy where at the very bottom, it's like you can't be a very good ally if you yourself are not great. Whatever that means, especially if you are also grieving this person who is no
Yes.
longer here. Um, and that I had just never even considered that before. It's like before you show up for people, you got to be ready for them, like, to hold them up. And I
Yeah.
think that's, you got to be selfish for a minute and you got to realize, like, I also like am kind of going through it right now. Let me take care of me and then I will be there front row.
Yeah. And I think, there's, I mean, going back to like misconceptions about grief, I think there's this idea that like when someone dies, there is a short window of time where you have to show up. And if you don't show up in that period of time, then you're a horrible person and it means that you don't love them and all this stuff. But like realistically, like it is okay to just be like, hey, I acknowledge this. I am here for you. And then at each moment that you engage, just check in with yourself before you do. It doesn't like, it doesn't have to be like a huge like, hey, I need to like do a therapy session before I like, go over to this person's house. But just like a subtle like check in, like, how am I doing? Do I have all my needs met before I am entering this situation, which is going to be extremely uncomfortable and unpredictable. And the best thing that you can do to be supportive to someone else is to like be there as your whole person and to understand what your strengths and limitations are in that. And that was a big thing. Like Will's death was sudden and completely unexpected, but I noticed a lot of people taking out like their like shock and anxiety instead of like reflecting inwards, being like, oh man, I am affected by this. Like this is not a small thing. um they were like, I am anxious and I'm going to take all that anxious energy and just pour it into helping you. And me being at the epicenter of this tragedy, like I was in shock and I was in shock for a very long time. And my like trauma response in those situations was to fawn. I was very aware and very tuned into the needs of everyone else. And I could see it on their faces. Like they were not okay. And I'm not saying that you have to be like 100% to show up. I'm just asking for a little bit more self reflection before entering that situation. On an airplane, they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first. And that's really all it is.
Mhm.
Just being like, hey, what do I need to be in this situation? Cool, got it. All right, let's head in.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I experienced similar fawning
Mm.
in situations like that. So, do you think that like and this might be asking a question that you might not be able to answer, so sorry if it is, but do you think that the same applies for other like trauma responses? Like if you are more like fight or flight, or I know there's other ones that I'm just not familiar with. Do you think that the reaction would be similar, or do you think to people coming in and still kind of have like having not that self-awareness of like checking themselves? Or do you think it kind of changes depending on how the person experiencing the trauma reacts? Does that make any sense at all?
Are you talking about the person in a like an allyship role, like what
Yeah.
their trauma response is and how they're going to act?
Or like I guess like depending on I feel like now I'm just like going down a rabbit hole.
No, please try. I'm totally cool talking about trauma. I just want to understand your question.
So I guess like if the person who has experienced the trauma directly has a different type of trauma response, do you think that affects how they feel about people who are coming to them maybe not being self-aware?
Mm, yeah, I think so. Definitely. I think my fawning response gave me like greater insight into what was happening in the situation. A
Mhm.
person who has more of a fight response might have just been like, might have fought them off,
Get
you know,
out.
or yeah, exactly. Or just been like completely angry and like, you know, maybe I would have tried to burn my house down if, you know, that was my response, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so there's like fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I think there's another one. Um, but yeah, I whatever the person's like the person at the center, um, whatever their trauma response is, I think you still need that self-awareness coming
Mhm.
in. Um, fully recognizing that you might be having your own trauma response,
Mhm.
right? And in that situation, you might recognize that, like, hey, I'm a flight. Like, my, and I think that's actually probably quite common in the context of grief support because it is such an uncomfortable, people are so death adverse until they've actually have to endure loss themselves. Do they realize that, like, it is very significant? But if they haven't had that lived experience, like, they may want to run.
Mhm.
And that self-awareness is just like recognizing, like, hey, I am terribly afraid of entering this situation because of what I am going to feel when I get there.
Mhm.
um and that's okay. I mean, you can still show up if you're afraid. You can still show up if you're anxious. um but yeah, being open and willing to explore the experience that you're having, whether it's a trauma response, whether it's discomfort,
Mhm.
whether it's feeling like a desperate need to be in the room with that person. I think that all factors into the situation. Absolutely.
Wow, I feel like it's so crazy, like, hearing you talk about, like, it like, literally everyone's trauma response is, like, fighting against each other and how everyone has to know how everyone is, like, reacting. I've just never thought about it that way.
Yeah, and I mean that's like why I think, I mean, I don't know scientifically, but why I would um presume that in the days after someone dies, like, it's a very like chaotic, tension is high, fights erupt, like, people like do not sleep well.
Mhm.
You know, people are often like outside of their comfort zones, and our, you know, we only have so much of like adrenal stores to like get us through those trauma responses, those like high intensity situations. And grief is not a short-lived experience. And all those trauma responses come from like our ancestors like getting, or they're built for things that we need to do in the short term, whether it's like pulling someone out of a burning building or
Mhm.
like darting out of the way if like a car is going to hit us or that sort of
Mhm.
thing. And we bring all that like intense, action oriented, like survival stuff into the situation, when in fact, like, this is an endurance event. It's more than a sport. Like, you talk about like sporting endurance event, like, it is so much greater than that.
Like
And yet we bring
lifelong
these very,
event.
Yeah.
exactly, and we bring these very like short-term tools
Mhm.
into the situation, which is another reason for the book, and like having a more like long-term outlook on how you need to show up.
Mhm.
Mhm. Um, so kind of going off of that, if you, let's say if you're the person who's going through the immediate loss, what are some ways that you could maybe ask for help? Or if someone is showing up for you and they're just like kind of not helping, what are some things that you can say to be like, hey, it would mean much more to me if you did this other thing, or I don't like it when you do this thing.
Mm, that's a great question. Um, so I would advocate for anyone who is showing up, like, show up first with like, with unconditional love. Recognize that everybody in this situation, because grief is so unique to every person, there is no way that you can show up and be perfect. So you are going to make mistakes. And that's just off the bat, understand that. And with unconditional love, you're going to get through it. Like, love each other no matter what. That's really important. For a person who is at the in the like immediacy of it, very close to the person who died, I would say that giving feedback is okay. It's going to take some courage to do that. But the more agency that you exert, particularly if there is trauma involved with the loss, the better off you are going to be later on down the road. And then in a person in a support role, I would say, like, be specific about how you can help and how you want to help. So, for example, like showing up and saying, like, hey, I suck in the kitchen, but I can help you with any like legal or administrative tasks. I am willing to show up and like help you clean your house like every Saturday morning. I go to the grocery store or I go to X store, on Thursdays after work. Send me your list and you don't have to leave the house. I will just drop things off at your door. Um, and then also like continuously remind that person that you do love them unconditionally and that you're open to feedback. That makes those lines of communication much easier to navigate, because the message that is often, thrown around is like, don't disappear. And let them know that you are available. But it is much easier to provide like feedback and like redirection if someone is like forthcoming in like how they are going to help. So a message saying like, I'm here if you need anything, doesn't really give me the understanding of like what it is that you actually like want and are capable of doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say like specifics are welcome and encouraged.
Yeah. And I thought it was great too that you make a point in the book. And I think especially now, like we can Zoom, we can FaceTime, do whatever. These are not just limited to people who are there. You can do an abundance of things, even if you are not physically with the person or unable to be physically with the person. Like, that is not a barrier at all. And I think you listed a lot of really good ideas to help someone if you're not physically there.
Yeah. So it's a great point. So in the book, I talk about active listening as like the one skill that everybody needs to have. And this goes along the lines of too of like, if you bring food, like that'll get you through the door, but what are you going to do when you get there? And active listening is like the real key to all of this. So active listening can happen, yeah, in person. It can happen on Zoom or FaceTime. It can also happen just like on a phone call. But really being capable of listening without any intention of trying to fix the person or like change their state, just let them get things off their chest, and to know that you are a safe space to do that is wildly powerful for someone who in our culture is probably being encouraged to like hurry up and get over it and to like get on with life. Giving them a space to be like, hey, what you are feeling is valid. Everything you are feeling is okay. There is nothing wrong with you. Like, this is a very human experience and I am not going to abandon you is so powerful.
Even just hearing you say it right now, I'm like, yes, preach, girl, preach.
It is Sunday
Yeah.
and we are at church.
Yes, welcome to Gospel Girl
Pastor
Church.
Aly.
Pastor
I
Aly
love
leading
it.
the sermon today.
Yeah.
And this
Available
right
to
here, this is
officiate
our
all your
Bible.
ceremonies. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
that's
Hand on the Bible.
love it.
I'm glad you brought up active listening because that's just something that I, as a human, just try to be good at. In terms of not giving unsolicited advice, not saying, oh my gosh, well, I experienced something similar too when this thing happened to me. So what are some other traits of a really good active listener that it doesn't necessarily have to be grief specific, but what are some really good ways to just also check in with yourself and being like, am I an active listener right now?
Mm.
Yeah, so I think the first like hallmark of active listening is that you are listening to understand and to learn. And that is the only thing that you are doing. I know a lot of us like walk through conversations in life and we listen to someone with the intention of like, how are we going to respond? And we're just queuing up what we're going to say next, right? Active listening, you don't do that. Active listening, you are paying attention with all your senses to the person that you are listening to. You're taking in their body language if that's available to you. You are encouraging them to continue with what's called like immediacy behaviors. So all those things that are like, okay, uh-huh, and like a nod to like, yep, like keep going. I'm like here and I'm listening. Your body language is like positioned towards them. You're not checking your phone, you're not like watching TV in the background. Um, you can eat maybe, I don't know, drink a cup of tea, like that seems appropriate. Um, but yeah, and it's repeating the language that they are using. So if someone goes like, this hurts so bad, and you say back like, I understand that it hurts so bad, they're like, thank you for sharing that with me, like that makes so much sense. um those words really like, they communicate that you are listening. I think another misconception too is that like if you put yourself in a grief allyship role or put yourself in a position where you're listening to someone who might have a story that brings you some discomfort, that cry like you're worried that you're going to cry. um and I want to make it clear to everyone that if you are listening to someone and they are telling your story and you start crying, there is no greater evidence that you are truly listening and being moved by what it is they're saying because you are crying. That's a really, really beautiful and powerful thing to give to someone. So don't worry about crying.
Oh,
Um,
thank you, because
yeah,
I am a crier, if you haven't figured that one out already.
I'm a crier too. I love it. Like bring on the tears. Like there's actual like hormone, like there's like some sort of like chemical that our body produces in our tears that's like liquid Tylenol, like running down our eyes when we cry from emotion. So bring it on. It's good for us.
Oh, I love to hear that. And I also will give kudos to Kristen because she is a great active listener. She always
Aw.
makes me feel supported and like my feelings are valid. So thank you, girly girl.
Thank you so much. Of course. I'm trying to get better
Oh,
every day,
Hmm.
but
and
it
that's a
feels very
great,
good to
great
hear that.
point too, is that active listening isn't something that like we're really taught to do. And like
Yeah.
anybody can learn the skill. And it
Mhm.
takes a lot of practice to get good. So like in any relationship that you are in, whether like you work at you're a cashier somewhere, like you can practice active listening like on a
Mhm.
regular basis and get really good at it.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So I guess as we start to wrap up a little bit here, I understand this like kind of the bigger point of your book, Grief Ally, but what is your advice to someone who says, I can't show up for this person in my life because I don't have the emotional strength or I don't have the tools that I think they need for me to help them? What is your advice to kind of get somebody to become a grief ally?
So first of all, buy the book, read the book.
Right. Of
Buy the
But I
course.
book.
think I think the overall lesson, and I think like this is like at the root of being a grief ally, is that recognize that your job is not to fix this. You you are not that powerful. No one is. And that is okay. What you can do is make this person's life more comfortable and easier. Whether that's just like in the moment with them, by being able to just like sit and listen and witness what they're experiencing, to using your, your assets and saying like, hey, do you want to come spend the weekend at my house? Like, I'll make you breakfast, you can have your own room, you can do whatever you want in there, but like I will provide you all your meals and you don't have to worry about anything. I think anybody can be a grief ally, personally, whether you are an overly emotional person or someone who is not an emotional person. Emotions don't really have anything to do with it. Like if you are a person who is self-aware enough to recognize that you love someone who needs your help and to know like, hey, this is what I'm good at and this is what I can do, then you can be a grief ally.
Okay, that's really powerful. And
Yeah.
because I know a lot of people, they may have the feeling that, you know, they themselves are emotionally guarded, or maybe they, you know, haven't gone through an immediate loss in
Mhm.
their life to be able to relate to somebody else on that level. And I think that's really reassuring for me to hear personally, because I feel like whenever someone in my life goes through a loss, I always feel like I wish that I could like take some of their pain. Like I wish that they could like lift off 20% of their pain and put it on me so I can carry it. And although it's not possible, but there are ways to sort of like make it a little softer, make it a little less heavy. Um, but just remembering that like you're not gonna cure them. You can't do that. Um,
No, no. And you know, I have the rules of like make their life easier and more comfortable. And a part of that is just empowering them to do what feels right for them in coping with how they are grieving and how their grief is like coming up for them. Um, because quite likely, like I know this for sure. Shame is a real risk for bereaved people as well as the grief allies. The grief allies are always wondering like, am I doing the right thing? Am I being helpful? Am I making a difference in this situation? And everybody who's grieving is like, am I doing this wrong? Is there something wrong with me? Like, will people be repelled by the version of me that I am becoming because of my grief? And to know that it's happening on both sides, the more open we are in our relationships and communicating and like being able to hold space for those people, for the people who are showing up for us and for ourselves, um, the better off we are all going to be, like moving down the road and making space for grief that is out in the open and allowed and the best uh the best for us, in how we need to cope with it and integrate it into our lives. Yeah.
Very powerful stuff.
Yeah, it is.
You know,
Well,
and I like selfishly, like that's the world I want to live in, you
mhm,
know, if we're being really candid here, like I am a changed person, because Will died. And to expect me to be the person that I was when he was here is impossible because he was
mhm,
such an integral part of my life.
mhm,
Um, and yet I still worry, like in certain circles, like maybe if I bring my grief with me and I give it a seat at the table, like am I going to be shunned, or like, you know, you see it in people's eyes like, oh no, we're talking about death and I'm uncomfortable.
mhm, mhm.
um I don't want to live in a world like that, to be very honest, but like death is a big part of my story and who I am today. So the more we talk about these conversations, the more we equip people with the tools to like live in relation with others, in this way, the more life everybody gets to experience. And yeah, that's the future I really want.
No, I
Very
definitely
powerful.
understand where you're coming from. It makes you a different person. And that was something that I appreciated you mentioning in your book because, you know, it goes back to those cliches you were saying and like everybody just kind of giving you this like, well, you know, you're starting to look like you did before. You're happy like you were before. It's like, ma'am, sir, whoever you may be, I will literally never be the same after this experience. And honestly, for you to say that to me right now is like, please go away. Go away.
Yeah,
Be here.
yeah, yeah. It's like you obviously have not experienced what I have experienced.
Yep, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And
your
how much it
ignorance is
changes
showing.
you. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the last thing we kind of wanted to ask was just, how obviously we just talked about the fact that you're different now. So, how do you feel that even maybe writing the book, finally getting it out there and published, how has your life changed since? And what else should we be keeping our eye out for?
Oh, I love that question.
I'm
Um,
curious.
yes. Um, the book, to say it like saved my life might be a bit of an exaggeration, but I think there's a big misconception that, grief is the same as like sadness. And yes, it is uncomfortable, but
Mhm.
there can be like any feeling on the feeling wheel is applicable in grief. And for me, this book has given me purpose, and it brought me a lot of joy in some really like dark times.
Mhm.
Um and selfishly, the book is a way that I get to keep Will alive with new people that I meet.
Mhm.
And that is something that is really special to me. Also, like, I like the person that I am today. I would never go back and
Mhm.
choose any of this. Like, I am not grateful for how I ended up being this person, but I do like the person that I am. I probably like her a hell of a lot more than the person that I was in 2019. Um, and that's just, how grief changes us. Um, and in terms of the future, ooh, juicy. Um,
Give us the tea,
gossip,
girl. Give us the
gossip,
gossip.
girly. Yeah. So I am hoping to launch some grief allyship training programs. So that if people aren't, the book type, that they can do the course and still equip themselves with the tools, or, dig a little deeper if this is something that they really want to do. Hopefully a few more books in my future too. But while I'm doing all that, I am finishing up school to be a counselor. So I start my practicum in September, and I'm going to be working as a grief therapist starting then. So a lot of stuff happening in the future.
Love it.
That's awesome. And I love stories like that where it's you take this terrible thing and it changes you forever, but you do change it into a beautiful, productive thing that is, most definitely who knows what your life would have been like if Will were still here.
Who
But
knows?
turning
I try not to think about it, but yeah.
right. But no, like the resource that you put out here is amazing. So other than of course your book, what other resources do you recommend to people who are either experiencing grief or just want to learn more about being a grief ally? What are some good resources?
Yeah. So first resource I'll recommend, I have a free Facebook group called Grief Ally Nation that anybody can join. It's a great place to ask questions or practice active listening or receive some active listening if you need to get something off your chest. Um, in my book, there's also a master resource list. You can find that also on my website or in my Instagram profile. And it is a list of podcasts, books, talks, journal articles that I highly recommend as like my go-to resources if you really want to do into a deep dive into grief. In terms of people specifically, I'm a huge fan of Megan Devine's work. She wrote It's Okay That You're Not Okay. Um, and it would be like, if you're going to read another book after you read my book, I would highly recommend that one.
Okay, that's
Definitely
really,
start
really
with
good.
Grief Ally, duh.
Yes.
Of course.
So speaking of which, anybody listening, where can they find your book? Where can they get it?
Yeah. So it is on all major book retailers. You can order it online. You can get it from a small bookstore too if you want to shop local. You just have to call them and ask them to order it for you. And then it's also available as you can get it in like a paperback, but it's also on Kindle and it's an audiobook. So however you want to consume the
Nice.
information, it is acceptable. But you can find the links to all the buying resources at alybird.com/book.
Well, let me tell you, girl, I got you covered because my Kindle died and I had to go on Apple Books and purchase it again. I was like, Miss Aly, I
No.
got you.
She double dipping.
Oh,
Yeah, I said, let me
that's
give her
great.
all those
Thank you.
residuals.
That's great. You're the 79 cents I got from Apple. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
And lastly, so where can people connect with you on social media?
Yeah. I'm on Facebook and Instagram as the Aly Bird. Super
Beautiful.
simple.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This was awesome. Again, very first guest. Doesn't get much better than this, but this I thought was just a wonderful experience. It's so awesome to actually talk to the author and talk to the person who created this wonderful resource. And I can only imagine all of the different research and things that you went through to get this book published. So it was
Yeah.
awesome. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for giving this resource to us. And we look forward to all the good stuff that's going to be coming from Miss Aly Bird.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so wonderful. I would have never known that I was your first guest. Seamless, flawless work.
Thank you. Thank you, Aly. Thank you.
Thank you so
But
much.
again, I just want to thank you so much, like Kristen said, for putting this resource out there. You know, I've experienced grief. Everyone has experienced going through it. And like I said earlier, I think it's not even just for people trying to be an ally, but it was just like so insightful thinking about how I went through the process during those times. And I think it's, you know, it's going to change how I go through the grief process in the future. And I hope that other people can, you know, get the opportunity to read the book and it'll help them in the future. And I just think it's so beautiful and amazing how you've taken this, you know, terrible situation and turned it into something that is going to be, you know, changing people's lives, and it made such a different and such a huge impact in your own life. And I'm appreciative, and I know that so many other people will be in the future too. And I'm hoping that we will be able to do this again. We will love to have you on the show for any other reasons, even if you just want to chit chat. That's what we do every Sunday at 4 p.m. So you just hit us up and we will bring you on. If you're a Real Housewives girly, a 90-Day Fiance girly, you tell us and we'll make it happen.
Oh, I love that. Love it so much. Thank you. I will definitely take you up on that invitation.
Yes.
Yeah. Stay soft, Kathy. It's okay to cry.
Oh, I'm trying. I'm trying.
Liquid Tylenol. Is that what you said, Aly?
Yeah, liquid Tylenol right down your cheeks. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks guys for listening. As always, go find Aly online, go follow her, check out her book, Grief Ally, and let us know what you think. I like that we kind of kept this conversation general, but it definitely makes a lot more sense in the context of the book, in the way that you have things structured and laid out for us. So thank you, of course, for joining us, and thank you guys for listening. We hope you enjoy it, and we will catch up with you later.
Bye.
Bye.